Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Survivor 50 Wishlist Podcast, an off-season series where we're determining who could and should come back for the upcoming returnee season of Survivor 50. My name is Mike Bloom, and bring your sun hat, your bug spray, and your monkey repellent, I guess. We are trekking 11 miles to your podcast feed to talk about Survivor Guatemala as we begin week 3 of this series, talking about a season that has not gotten a lot of love from production, but has from the fans. And so I think in particular, we're going to be talking about a good amount of second chance possible candidates, but also maybe some people that have come back multiple times and deserve another look at. Now, of course, I am not alone here. I couldn't have said the words Guatemala without this man following close behind, ready to play this figurative game of Mancala alongside me as we try to figure out who to place on this short list and hopefully not get called scumbags along the way. It is the great Jordan Kalish. Hey, Jordan.
Hey, how you doing? The word Survivor Guatemala, or the phrase Survivor Guatemala, it's like the bat signal for me. You say it and I show up. The link just appeared on my screen. I clicked on it and now I'm here with Mike Bloom.
Oh, please, Jordan, I do not advise just clicking links that randomly show up on your screen. You have been infected with malware, but I guess you're not like collapsing like all the men of Guatemala in the first few days.
Yeah, I need to be taken care of by Margaret because of all the links that I've been clicking on.
Well, hopefully we'll be taking care of you today as, again, we're going to try to leave this podcast determining a short list of candidates for this fan poll at the end of this entire experiment. And Guatemala, I have said, is the most underrated season of Survivor. And that is largely because, maybe with some recent exceptions, it is one of the most forgotten seasons of Survivor. We talked about this a bit with Marquesas, but I think certainly the elements which made things invigorating to us, a lot of the arduous circumstances, the heat, the animals, etc., made for some captivating jungle-based television. Maybe not so for the crew that was actually living out there. And for, a certain amount of reasons, despite the fact that I think we have an incredibly fun group of people, especially once you get past those first 4 boots, we've only ever seen the top 2 come back, which hopefully we'll be able to give some love today to those who have not had the opportunity to return, maybe skew a bit more towards the wish part of wish list. But Jordan, let me ask you, memes aside, what are your thoughts on Guatemala?
So I would agree with you here. I think there are a lot of people in the RHAP community who think that Jordan Kalish's favorite Survivor season is Guatemala. And I am sorry to disappoint. Guatemala is not my favorite season of Survivor.
Jordan, listen, take it from a guy who's been in the business 10 years. You gotta lean into the meme. Okay?
I do, trust me, I do lean into it. And I do love Survivor Guatemala. I will say that. And I think you said it perfectly, Mike, that it is the most underrated season. I think that, we've never had anybody, like you said, come back from the show, with the exception of Stephanie, who's not really who's thought of more as a Palau player.
Danny Erasure, Jordan.
and Danny, who came back from Winners at War. So until season 40, we had never had someone come back. It was fun to see Danny come back in Winners at War. I don't know if she was really in her element in that season, but it's a season where there were so many memorable characters and funny things that happened. I think it's one of the funniest seasons in Survivor history. And unfortunately, it does get forgotten about because of the fact that I guess maybe the gameplay wasn't the most dynamic, but I think in certain circumstances post-merge, there were a lot of twists and turns, and then you had this big comeback win from Danny. So I think there are some good things that happened in the season, and it deserves more love than it gets.
Yeah, I mean, I've been talking about how the post-All-Stars era of Survivor, probably like through Micronesia, is what I would call the experimental era of Survivor, and Guatemala is a key example of that. This is the first time that we bring in returning players to play alongside new players, and the return of Bobby, John, and Stephanie, fresh off of their time on Palau, which works both for and against them sometimes, but certainly I think brought up a lot of conversation at the time as to how unfair is the advantage that returning players have over new players. This, of course, will be the first introduction of the hidden immunity idol, granted, not in the form that we know and love nowadays. It's more so like a second immunity necklace that you could basically play before the vote. But to your point about the gameplay, yeah, it doesn't seem as stagnant as the crocodile-filled waters that surrounded Guatemala, to the point where they couldn't go in except for the pool that they installed. I think there were some legitimate flips that were happening. Look as far back as the swap when Nakum has a numerical advantage and then Judd hops over to decide to vote against his former tribe mates, or something like Brian trying to claw his way out of the bottom and succeeding in getting Blake out. Going to the merge, that yes, we do get Danny's alliance getting cold a little bit, but there are things like the Jamie boot, the Judd boot, the Cindy boot, the Lydia boot, where it wasn't necessarily like a down the line one after another. And it was kind of helmed by this 1-2 punch in the form of Rafe and Stephanie making all of these decisions. Not to mention, I really do feel like, though certainly there have been people who were voted out surprised before in Survivor, this feels like, to me, one of the first times you really emphasize the idea of blindsides. I mean, Jamie quite literally says, blindsided, nice. Now that's how you do it. And I feel like Jeff Probst doesn't want to bottle a lot from Guatemala for whatever reason, but I feel like that's the attitude that he wanted to do moving forward. Of course, you have some other iconic lines like Judd's, hope you get bit by crocodile, scumbag. Cindy's, I'll think of you while I'm looking out the sunroof of my new car. Like, there's a lot of really fun stuff happening. Again, particularly in the post-merge, there's, for people that until 46 were missing some of that conflict and drama from the new era, we certainly got that here with the wild, polarizing relationship between Bobby, John, and Jamie. I really think there's a lot of there in Guatemala, not to mention one of the most, I would say, culturally based seasons in Survivor history. Now, look, that does come with a certain measure of appropriation, but we got to learn a hell of a lot about the Maya and everything they had influence on, from basketball to calendars to corn to even Bobby John imparts some knowledge on us about how Maya tribe leaders used to come over and visit each other. So listen, I would say that maybe the Maya have a bit more of a footprint in history than Guatemala does in Survivor history.
I would agree with that. I think the Mayan people definitely more influential. But look, like you said before, first season ever with the Idol, all of these contentious relationships that sort of, it looks like with Bobby John and Jamie at the end, it looked like they were friends on the jury. So I would maybe want to delve more into that if you were to cast those two on Survivor season 50. I don't know if that's happening, but I totally agree with you, Mike. And do you think that Jeff got his famous line, "That's how you do it on Survivor," from Jamie Newton?
Wow.
You bring up a good point, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could be possible where, of course, we know Jamie at the time was a jet ski instructor. Could Jeff have said, I drove a jet ski once. Can you give me some lessons next time? And while he's going, Jeff's like, I got this thing in my head that you said as you were on your way out. That's how you do it on Survivor. Can I borrow that from you? And Jamie's like, sure, that will surely be the least significant thing that's brought out from Guatemala. And Jeff's like, bet. And maybe that is a little piece that he decided to take out of him from the jungle.
Yeah, it's a good Moncala back to that great line from Survivor history.
All right, well, let's move forward here and see which players we'll put on the short list and which ones we are sacrificing like that chicken that was then eaten by 3 out of the 4 tribe members at the end. All right, so let's start with our top 2 here. And this is an interesting conversation just right off the top because, again, these are the only 2 people to return from Survivor Guatemala. Stephanie, I will say, is a foregone conclusion. Of course, if you listen to Friday's podcast with Haley Strong, Stephanie is on the ballot from Palau. Suffice it to say, her performance put her forward there. So she is already taken care of. But let's talk about Danny, because Danny was this very enigmatic Survivor player. And I wouldn't say necessarily from the realm of like, oh, she clawed her way back from being down in the numbers and, made her way to the end and won. I mean, we saw that with Chris Doherty to a certain extent, Vesepia as well. But Danny had one of the quietest edits of a Survivor winner, and it's due in part to the fact that, as she coined in the reunion, she wasn't just under the radar, she beat the radar. And again, this was the first season in Survivor history where they mixed returning and new players, and Danny had a certain mind to say, okay, if I talk about what I'm doing in confessional, listen, production probably wants to help Stephanie and Bobby John get as far as possible. Otherwise, what's the point of bringing them back? So I'm not going to show my cards here. Let me try to play coy. I believe she talks on Talking with T-Bird about like how she gave kind of a pageanty answer during one tribal council, and like Jeff actually stopped filming and was like, all right, cut the bullshit. Give me a real answer to this. They resume filming. Danny answered the question the exact same way. Like, she was not budging whatsoever. But the fact of the matter is, she wins one of the first advantages in Survivor history as well. Another piece of experimentation. She wins a challenge advantage in the auction. She gets in good with Rafe and Stephanie to the point that she becomes their number 3 over Cindy, over Lydia, over Judd, and is able to take advantage of, a certain type of final immunity challenge, and Rafe reneging on his own promise to go to the end and summarily defeat Stephanie. Winners at War, not Danny's best season. I would say the edit certainly carries over, and to your point, I'm not sure if it's just due to the fact that she left early or because there was so much other big bombastic gameplay happening, especially early on, and Danny was gonna keep doing those Danny things. But it does beg the question, Jordan, did we get enough of that sort of what if answered with Danny for time number 2? Or, as she expressed, would you want to see her for time number 3?
So I think in Winners at War, she was maybe a little bit of a crocodile out of water from the swamps of Guatemala. Clearly played a good game in Guatemala. I don't think it's the most exciting win of all time, but she did what she needed to do. She got to the end. She did play a very under the radar game, and I think she proved why she's a Survivor winner, and she was clearly more well liked than Stephanie. Winners at War, I think that maybe the game of Survivor has passed her by, because I think it sort of looked like the new era with all the voting blocks and all the advantages that are now in the game. And yes, she was the beneficiary of an advantage, and maybe the most important challenge advantage win in Survivor history, because she probably
that's not saying much considering how a lot of them have amounted to.
No, it usually doesn't matter all that much. With her, she probably doesn't win the game without that. So good for her getting that advantage. Very, very smart move by her. But I think, based on what we saw in Winners at War, I don't think we need to see Danny back on Survivor again. If she's on, it would be cool. I mean, it would be the winner of the most underrated season of all time and my supposed favorite season getting back. But I would rather see people that I haven't seen back from Guatemala. And I'm not going to put Stephanie in this category, because Stephanie, rightly from the Palau podcast, did make it onto the list. If they do a Survivor, like Survivor Legends, Survivor All-Stars 2, Stephanie is a bona fide Survivor legend. We saw her on Traders, where I think she was fun on Traders. I think Survivor is definitely maybe more of her speed. But as the two people on this board, I would definitely rather see Stephanie back on the show. If Danny got on, I would be very surprised. I'm not putting her on my personal list. She's not my favorite player from Guatemala, even though she was the winner. But it was cool seeing her on Winners at War, and I wish we'd maybe seen a little bit more from her, but I think there's a reason we didn't.
Yeah, I think she is a super solid player in particular. Like, she is sort of in the same boat as, I would say, maybe an Amanda Kimmel, of like, it seems like almost every season she plays, she would go at least pretty far, because she obviously is athletic. She has some strategy to her, and obviously she has social skills for days. But yeah, I do kind of feel like that itch got scratched in bringing her back for Winners of War, especially with the what if of like, well, she hit her game so much the first season, what would happen the second season? She has expressed that even before Winners at War, she was contacted allegedly for seasons like Game Changers, but outright said that she wouldn't do it until it was an all winners season. Again, she has expressed, I think, in some like Instagram lives and podcasts afterwards, that now she wants to go back for a third time. So it's not like we're necessarily speaking to someone maybe like an Amber or an Ethan that's like, nope, I'm done. I don't need to do this again. But I personally feel like I'm okay with it. People could disagree, because I feel like maybe they feel there's some unexplored potential there. For me, the question was kind of answered with Danny coming back. And I think especially we're going to have a very tough time choosing only a select group of people from this list. And Danny would probably be like a number 5 or 6 for me among this cast.
there are so many people who have only played once, or maybe they've played more than once, but it's been such a long time and I'd want to see more from them that I'm not going to put Danny on my list ahead of them. I'm not going to look, if she gets on, I'm not going to be on Twitter saying, how can you put Danny Boat right back on Survivor? I would say, cool, let's see it. Let's see what happens. But again, just not that high in my list. And it's funny you bring up the fact that she was asked for game changers. Apparently, I feel like that would have been a much better spot for her than Winners at War. Winners at War was a season where all the old school players were being targeted. Game Changers was a season where all the random people got to the end. And I even feel like as a winner, she would have been considered maybe a random person, and she could have maybe done well on Game Changers. So I think maybe poor strategy on Danny's part to want to go back for Winners at War instead of Game Changers.
Well, listen, Danny, even if she doesn't end up on this list, does get to take a victory lap in probably the Chiefs three-peating this year, right? That feels like a victory in and of itself.
That's true. And hey, if Dan, I think we're gonna get into Taylor Swift a little bit later down the line in this podcast. But Danny, maybe she brings in the all the Swifties because she is married to a former Kansas City Chief.
Yeah, imagine Danny and Charlie together, all the conversations they could have.
Yeah, Harrison Butker doesn't think that Danny should be on Survivor.
Oh, Lord. But surprisingly, not to spoil too many of other podcasts this week, not the last time Harrison Butker will be referenced in this series so far.
Oh, no.
Well, let's kick it over to our jury here. Oh, why did I put the Palau jury here?
Hi, Palau.
There we go. Perfect. I just had Palau on the brain because of Stephanie. Here we go. Here are the right people to speak about, and what a group to speak about. Again, just an incredible group of characters. We have Rafe, Lydia, Cindy, Judd, Gary Hogaboom Hawkins, the aforementioned blindsided nice Jamie, and his rival, Bobby John. Where do you want to start here, Jordan? Because we have a wealth of people to talk about.
So I think let's start at we already did first and second place. Let's go to our third place player. Let's go to Rafe.
So Rafe is, I would say, one of the most solid players to not win the game. I think a lot of people remember Guatemala as Stephanie was in charge and she was the one making all of these decisions and taking the heat for it. Rafe was in this perfect position where he was making these decisions alongside her and was taking none of the heat, even though it was 104 degrees in Guatemala. That this was sort of the good cop to Stephanie's bad cop in a way, that he was able to make these decisions alongside her to cut people like Jamie, cut people like Judd, but also be able to like maintain good friendships and relationships with them where they didn't feel as burned by Rafe as they did by somebody like Stephanie. Maybe the lone exception is the Cindy boot, where it seems like Rafe feels super spurned by her not giving this car away to him and everybody else, and he decides to really spearhead her ouster. But even then, it seems like Cindy is, more so pissed at Stephanie than Rafe. Rafe sort of has this kind of crumbling at the end that we see from players in this era, like Twyla, like Ian, like Dreams, where he and Stephanie make these kind of controversial decisions, right? Where despite Danny not being immune, they do take out Cindy, they do take out Lydia. Now there are reasons behind that. And then he goes to the final three and tells Danny, again, to echo Ian, it's okay. I know you promised to take me to the end. You don't need to do that anymore. And again, people might see that as a quit towards the end. I don't think Rafe was undergoing as much of a moral crisis as Ian did, but it was still kind of an eyebrow raiser when it came to, especially the big gaminess that Rafe had. But I feel like Rafe had a really competent game. Even from a challenge perspective, I think he won like 3, maybe 4 individual immunity challenges, if you count the pre-merge stuff, which is pretty damn good for, again, someone on paper you would not expect to dominate physically. But of course, I think the big thing we need to talk about, Jordan, is Rafe's prolific career after Survivor and how much that would exclude him from wanting to participate in this.
I mean, we've seen people, and he is a prolific Hollywood writer. We have seen a prolific Hollywood writer go on the show in Mike White. So I don't think it necessarily precludes him from going on. I think if it's something he only has to, I guess you're only taking off a month or 2 from work, so he could probably do it if he wanted to.
Should there be another strike so that Rafe can go play?
Yes, exactly. I'm not rooting for a strike. I like having new TV shows, but I do think that Rafe, like you said, played a very strong game, and I think he basically played until that very end decision a almost flawless game of Survivor. He had the same exact voting history as Stephanie. The difference is people liked Rafe. People did not really like Stephanie by the end of the game. So that's why it's not just about like having a perfect voting record. It's about, first of all, are you somebody who had influence on who the vote was? And or were you just going along? And I don't think Stephanie or Rafe were just going along. I think they were both strategically playing very well. They were the two people that I think were most, most influential in who went home on each vote. The difference is Rafe was friends with everybody. Everybody liked Rafe. And the reason that Stephanie lost to Danny is that Stephanie wasn't all that well liked. I also think she had the returning player stigma that Rafe wouldn't have had. I do think at the end when Rafe, kind of releases Danny from her promise, I don't know what Danny would have done. She may have voted out Rafe anyway. It was clearly would have been the right decision, and nobody would have begrudged Danny from breaking that final 2 deal with Rafe. But Rafe is a writer, and one of my favorite lines in TV show history is "no half measures" from Breaking Bad, and I feel like this was a half measure where he had
no Rafe
Danny,
measures.
No Rafe measures. Yeah, he had Danny, sort of bound to this promise, which of course she wasn't really bound to because she could do whatever she wants once she wins that final immunity. But I think that was his only mistake, was that one little human moment. And it comes after the other human moment of not eating the chicken, which I think that's, maybe he would have won the final immunity if he had the protein from the chicken.
Yeah, the magical chicken juju in him.
Yeah, exactly. But no, I really don't think that's the reason he lost. I think that was just a good challenge for Danny. I think his one mistake was releasing her from that promise, but who knows? Danny might have made the right move anyway, which was taking Rafe out. But the fact that we're saying all this about Rafe, he's such a good person to bring back, I think, because he was so good at the game, but made this one potentially fatal error at the end. And it's the kind of player that I would like to see back again. And look, season 50 is going to be filled with these huge threats. And I do think Rafe is a big threat, but he's not going to be looked at as like the biggest target when you have people who have played also really good games, but a lot more recently.
Yeah. So Rafe had said in his quarantine questionnaire from December 2020, when asked if he would play again, "The timing has never worked out with my work, and I think at this point no one remembers who I am. Ha. But if they asked, of course," which from a fan's perspective was a bit of news, because I do believe that he had been asked at least once after his time on Guatemala to come back, but he had really jumped into moving to Hollywood, beginning his career in screenwriting. Of course, he started working in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. before becoming the showrunner and head writer of The Wheel of Time on Amazon. I know he's developing a couple of other shows right now, God of War, Warhammer as well. So I think it might be tough from a practicality perspective to pull him away, but I think Survivor would be into it. I think the Mike White example is a great one, where I think there could be, even if Rafe claims, "Oh, nobody can remember who I am," I think there is some appeal now to Rafe kind of having some more clout to him. He's not exactly Mr. Schneebly in terms of on-screen personality, but Rafe is someone that has become like this pretty big figure consistently when it comes to creating these TV shows, where I think he could come on. And while we talk about people who have changed since the last time we played, it's very different for Rafe. It's more occupational than it is personal. And that could be a really fun narrative as well, of like, Survivor helped jumpstart my career into getting into the entertainment industry, and now I've kind of come back and tried to write my own story in a different way. And so he's not exactly saying no to it. I think it might be hard to work out from a realistic standpoint, given all the pots he has his fingers in, pots of corn. At the same time, again, this is a bit of a fictional exercise, and if Rafe's not saying no, who are we to do the same?
Exactly. I think he earned a spot to play a second game. And I think with Rafe, I mean, it also depends on what the theme is. If you're calling it Survivor Legends, is Rafe a Survivor legend? Probably not. But if it's a, heroes versus villains, he's sort of ambiguous, right? Because he's played a villainous game where he was going after his targets. He was like usually the person who's like the strategist of the season is seen as more of a villain. But I think he was looked at pretty heroically by his tribe. So I think he could fit into either one of those groups. But if you had an old school versus new school, or if you just had like an all-stars, I think he is an all-star level caliber player. And I also think that Jeff always says you can go from being a David to being a Goliath, but you can't go the other way. He's a clear example of someone who was a David and now is a Goliath in the industry.
Well, let's move on to another big personality from this game, arguably one of the biggest, Judd Sargent. Judd, if I could describe it in one word, it would probably be belligerent. This is somebody who, from the very first tribal council he goes onto a diatribal, if you will, about we're just going to take the ball down the damn field, man. We're going to do it all the way every single time. When Jeff asked him like a 3-word question, and that just opened up a whole can of worms as to who Judd is. Obviously, he is going to go on this tirade on Margaret, infamously during the double tribal council. And that's an attitude he's pretty much going to maintain the entire time, where he ends up really falling in line behind Stephanie and Rafe once that swap happens, sticks with them until the bitter end, where he is blindsided. And then, well, he doesn't have the kindest words for Dani. Talks about her unlacing her ice skates, right, from all the gliding she's done over the course of this game. Does vote for her to win. Now, there have been some differing reports, Jordan. I believe some people have said that, according to production, Judd was difficult to work with, which, listen, given, I think, his temper, kind of would make sense. And so some people might think, okay, he's on the definitive no-fly list, quite literally no-fly to Fiji. Should be noted, according to Judd himself on Talking with T-Bird, he did get interest calls for Heroes versus Villains and Blood versus Water. So it's not incredibly recent, but I do wonder the validity of those reports, considering that it seemed like they wanted to play at least a little bit of ball with Judd following Guatemala.
Yeah, I mean, look, I can't speak from the production point of view. Maybe he was very difficult to be around, but as a character on the show, he is the number one person I would want to see back. And to me, the fact that he was the biggest character on the season, he gets taken out in a spectacular way and has this incredible exit. And it's kind of amazing that he's never played again, especially when 9 seasons later, it was sitting right there, Heroes versus Villains. He was one of the biggest villains of this like middle school, like 11 through 19 era of Survivor. I think he's more fun than a Russell Hantz. I don't think he's as necessarily, control. He wasn't like controlling any of the votes really, but he was in on a lot of the stuff maybe in the early merge. But in terms of being a villainous presence, but a fun villainous presence for the viewers, I think he's such a perfect character, and it's incredible that they've never brought him back. And maybe it is a personality thing with him in production, and if that's the case, it's probably not going to happen. But he is and I guess I don't know if I'm spoiling this too early, but he's my number one from this cast who I want to see back.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I could absolutely see it. I know he's certainly been on a lot of people's list as to like, this guy was absolute lightning in a bottle. Why has he not been brought back? I mean, the Heroes versus Villains question is obviously a big one. They just had too many people to fit in. That'll be a conversation I have with Rob on a different day. But yeah, Judd really sticks out, even though I would say that like Jamie might be personified as like the more, boastful kind of like enemy frat in a college movie type of villain. And maybe Rafe and Stephanie might be personified as the more like cold, calculating villains. Judd is sort of like the big meathead villain, kind of like a Biff Tannen from Back to the Future.
That's a great comparison.
This is a guy that's going to come in and speak his mind. He single-handedly, I think I would say, quintupled or septupled the use of the word man in Survivor history over the course of his time in the season. Just an absolutely fantastic personality. I did get the chance to interview him. I did a series for Winners at War where, since we couldn't do exit press because of the Edge of Extinction, I got to speak to people from the season of the person that was eliminated. So I was able to get on the phone with Judd and hear him talk about Dani, which was really interesting. So he obviously kept up with the show at least through 40, and he is dying to go back, which is interesting because you could think, on the one hand, would this be a guy that did not positively receive his own edit of like, oh, they showed too much of me being bad and not, maintaining relationships enough. But he is hungry, Jordan, to return. He even says in his Talking with T-Bird at the very end, like, hey, if anyone's listening from production, please put me on. I'm willing to go. So he's as thirsty for a return appearance as he was for those extra beers.
Look, you said you started this podcast by saying lean into the meme. If you're Judd, you should love the edit that you got. Okay. I'm sure there were times that people did like being around him, but they showed the stuff that made Judd such a good character, and that was all of the stuff where he was getting in fights with his tribe, getting in fights especially with Margaret in the pre-merge. His exit, which is one of the best exits ever in Survivor, and you compare him to Biff Tannen. I think it's perfect. Judd has man, Biff has manure.
Yeah, exactly. Puts the man in manure. I should also note some ages here. So Judd is 53 at the moment, which actually puts him on the younger end of things from the other players that we're bringing back here. He's the same age as Chris Doherty, actually the same age as like people that we're going to talk about tomorrow in the form of Sari and Shane. Rafe is 41, which would actually put him on the younger side. Alongside,
Rafe was very young on the show, though.
Yeah, I believe he was 24 when he played. No, 22 actually.
Really, Rafe was 20. Wow, you know what? I think he carried himself so well. I would not have guessed that he was 22.
Yeah, so these people would actually be comparatively on the younger side as well. Let's talk about the person that finished right before him in Gary Hogaboom. Jordan, listen, you're a man of sports, not a captain of sports. I might venture to say Gary Hogaboom is probably the most entertaining ex-pro athlete we have had on Survivor.
I 100%. I think that he was, first of all, the Gary Hawkins Hogaboom stuff. I would like to see him come back to see if he tries to pull off Gary Hawkins again. That would be great.
In retrospect, it is incredible. And maybe it's because, again, this was, filmed and aired in 2005 where the internet was less of a big thing. But the fact that this man, who is like a pretty well-known NFL quarterback, walks in, decides, I'm going to use the same first name and first initial, but change my name completely. No, I'm not an NFL quarterback. I'm a landscaper named Gary Hawkins. But then it gets to the extent where he gets called out for, oh, did you go to Central Michigan? And decides he's going to tell a white lie in the form of, no, I went to Central Michigan, but I'm not Gary Hogaboom. So even though
I went to the very specific kind of small college that Gary Hogaboom went to.
So
I'm the same height and look the same.
That's the thing. I look very much like Gary Hogaboom. 67% of my name is similar to Gary Hogaboom. I probably went to this college at the same time as Gary Hogaboom, but you are way off, sister. You're not Gary I'm not Gary Hogaboom.
He was my roommate. I used to look in the mirror and he was always right there, but it's not me.
And the fact of the matter is, though, the reason why I say, even outside of that, why he was so entertaining is because, he had a little bit of fight to him. He had a little bit of a mouth on him. When it turned out that the cards were not in his favor, especially at the merge, he ends up finding the first ever hidden immunity idol. And not only that, he did it without a clue. Russell Hantz, eat your heart out here, where he's just tailing Judd, who has this clue, who tells everybody, all right, the clue says it's definitely on the ground. And then Gary just observes Judd gazing up in the trees like he's bird watching. And
that was his clue, Mike. He had the clue. Whatever Judd said, just do the opposite, and that's gonna be where the idol is. So I think he sort of had a clue.
And so he snatches it right under from Judd's nose, plays it admittedly when he doesn't need to, but again, he just saw his alliance member get taken out in Brandon. And then even when doom is spelled for him, he goes out, I wouldn't say swinging, but certainly mouthing off. In his final tribal council, he's talking about how everyone's idolizing Stephanie, but they can get her autograph after the show. He calls out Judd for saying, I've never told a lie. And Gary says, well, here's a lie. The idol is definitely on the ground. And I think even though it was not something that won him any brownie points, it certainly did from the fandom. Now, Gary, I think, has kind of disappeared in the interim since. Obviously, he has led a life both before and after Survivor. He is 65 years old, which wouldn't be the oldest person we'd put on this list. But because we haven't gotten a formal answer from him as to whether he would come back, I would be slated to put him a bit lower on this list than some other people who have said yes. But damn, I would love it. I'd absolutely love it.
If we have season 50 with Gary Hawkins Hogaboom, I would be very happy. I think I've always been a big Gary fan. I think he's one of the people who made this such a fun season. I do think I'd rather see Judd and Rafe. But Gary, it would just be such a nostalgic guy to have back on the show. And I think would maybe come in with definitely less of a target than Judd, because Judd's going to put a target on himself from day one. So I think he would do better than Judd. I think he's a better player than Judd. And I think that, if there's a lot of, let's say it's a bunch of these like new era super fans that get on who are like doing Survivor trivia podcasts, and like they're all going to know who Rafe is. They're not going to sleep on Rafe. They're going to know how good of a player he is. So I think Gary can maybe slip under the radar more than a Rafe, and clearly more than a Judd.
I mean, there was a little bit of, I would say, convenient or inconvenient casting that, of course, Gary was cast on the same season as a sports radio host and recognized him immediately. But I feel like 9 out of 10 times, people aren't necessarily recognizing Gary Hogaboom, especially nowadays where, to your point, they're bringing on Survivor superfans, not Dallas Cowboys superfans. Maybe Danny McRae would recognize Gary Hogaboom.
So yeah, I don't know if Danny McRae has seen Survivor Guatemala, but maybe he would know him from the Dallas Cowboys, maybe the fan events that they've done or something. Maybe that could be a little pregame alliance that the two of them have. Danny McRae, Gary final two. I think Gia Worthy would be going crazy if that's the final two of Survivor 50. But yeah, that could be
I think
fun.
Jimmy Johnson would be going the craziest though. How about them Cowboys?
Yeah. The first time the Cowboys have gotten to the finals in a very long time.
Exactly. That's the representation we need.
And then you need Jervis on the jury, who if it would, it's probably gonna be a final three. Jervis would vote for whoever is not the Dallas Cowboys. So I think that person could get Jervis's vote.
Unless Jimmy Johnson was in the final three, then I think Jervis would have to be the
Jervis would quit. Jervis
have to vote for one of us.
He would leave. Jervis would quit the game. He cannot vote for a Cowboy.
All right,
I've seen his Facebook posts.
Let's talk about Jamie Newton, because Jamie is someone who, again, for one reason or another, I don't think has explicitly said whether he would come back or not. He'd be a really interesting story because Jamie is so enigmatic to me, Jordan, where it really seems like there's some times where he's just this kind of like chill, bro-y type of guy. Other times he is puffing his chest and like going apeshit, going toe-to-toe with Bobby John, quite literally. Sometimes he's this negative Nancy pouting the entire time during that boat trip. Sometimes he's talking shit during a challenge. Sometimes he is freaking out his alliance by being super paranoid that he's going to be blindsided, which then incidentally led to his own blindside. And then he's wearing like this pop-collared shirt, noogieing with Bobby John on the jury. He really is one of the most interesting characters in Guatemala for me, and that's saying a lot.
Yeah, it's hard to pin him down. I feel like he was probably more of a villainous character. He definitely was. You called Judd belligerent. I think at times Jamie was definitely a belligerent character too. But then he could also chill and play Guatemala, and he could end up becoming friendly with the guy that he got in the biggest fight with during the season. I think that Jamie is one of these people who it's hard to really turn him into a reality TV character, because usually you're turned into a character based on whatever your I guess your most present quality is. But Jamie didn't really have one personality. He had multiple personalities out there, and I think it made him a fascinating person to watch on the show. Do I need to see Jamie Newton play Survivor again? I think it would be interesting to see what he's like now as an older guy. I don't know if you have his current age. Not that he's an old man, but he's definitely older than he was on season 11.
He is 43. And what's interesting is if I did a little bit of peeking at Jamie's Instagram, I believe he's joined the Air Force. I think he's out of the force now, but obviously I think has become a bit more buttoned up in his time. Should be noted, Jamie also given a consideration for Blood versus Water. Though what I will say about Jamie and Judd and a third contestant that we'll talk about from this merge portion is that I do wonder how much of that was like we saw with people like Otis and Vetus and even Brad and Monica Culpepper, like casting for the relationship and the loved one rather than the player, where Jamie has an identical twin brother named, of all things, Raimi. And we'll talk about maybe some other twins that could be possibly cast on Blood versus Water. So I don't know how much production would consider him for another season. He could be one of those types like we've spoken about with some other players of like, to your point, this guy has grown up considerably over the time since he's been in Guatemala. What could he bring to that? But it's just a real, again, murderer's row of characters to bring back. And while Jamie, again, is certainly someone that is so fascinating, it's a tough time for me to necessarily have him make like a top 3 or top 4.
I agree with that. I do think like Judd and Rafe are sort of top of the line for me. I think Gary is maybe a little bit lower because it would just be interesting to see Gary play again. I think Jamie, it's sort of like if Judd wasn't on the season, maybe Jamie would have been the biggest like the biggest contentious character. But since Judd was there, I think Judd is really the one you'd rather see back. But look, seeing Jamie Newton again, I think a lot of these people are aspirational. I don't know how many of these people really have a chance to get onto 50. If Jamie came back, I would like to see what he's like now. But there are so many people, not just from Guatemala, but from all the seasons, that aired a long time ago, that maybe I would be more excited about. But Jamie was fun, and he was clearly a unique character that we haven't seen too many people like Jamie.
Well, let's talk about his frenemy here in Bobby John, because full disclosure, on the Palau podcast, Haley Strong and I really went back and forth as to Bobby John played 2 times. To a certain extent, is there this idea of like, okay, we got to see Bobby John get kind of a fair shake. He wasn't on a tribe that lost every single immunity challenge. He made it to the jury, and he certainly, I would say, was a more mild-mannered version of himself, but then he also does have this like wild rivalry with Jamie. On the other hand, Bobby John has gone on to say in his quarantine questionnaire that he would like to play again, that this is a guy, as we were just talking about with Jamie, that has grown up. He currently is a father as well, working for the State Department in Alabama. He is 47 years old. So we did kick the can and say, let's talk about it for Guatemala. So Jordan, offer me your opinion. Would you want to see Bobby John back for a 3rd season?
So I remember watching Guatemala, and I remember seeing Bobby John descend from the Mayan pyramid or ziggurat or whatever that's called. I'm not sure what the terminology is, but when I saw Bobby John, I was like, this is exciting. He was on this horrible Oolong tribe, and he and Stephanie were able to get to the final 2, and he loses the fire making challenge. So I do think he was a good person to bring back for Guatemala. I think Stephanie was clearly the more the more 3-dimensional character as opposed to Bobby John, where Bobby John's main thing in on the Oolong tribe is that he would make grunty noises, and he was just good at challenges, and they couldn't really afford to get rid of him, but still, even with him, they couldn't win. So Bobby John comes back for Guatemala, and he's on his initial tribe. Like he is one of the people who breaks down after the hike.
Oh yeah, I mean, he was, I think, before Russell Swan, like, and obviously a certain man in Australia who must not be named, like, he is the guy who probably came to close to dying on camera, where like his eyes are rolling to the back of his head. He's clearly losing consciousness as Margaret's tending to him in that opening episode.
Yeah, so we see that in the first episode, but then he recovers, and pre-merge he is doing pretty well, but then he merges. He's in a clear minority. He's even talked about as potentially the merge boot there when Brandon Bellinger goes out. But I think Stephanie sort of saves his butt because she feels bad about not putting him on the jury. It turns out that he will end up voting for Danny. I think Stephanie,
also because I believe when Stephanie is asked, who would you not want to see on the jury, she replied, "Oh, Bobby John, because he's first on the jury."
Yeah, which makes no sense because she was the one. They could have gone after him, but Stephanie had a lot of sway on that vote, and I think just she had that Oolong partnership and wanted him to at least get that far. But I don't really think we saw anything from Bobby John that would warrant a 3rd time on Survivor. I think he seems like a nice guy. He is, I think, maybe a little bit of a 2-dimensional character, and there are just I'll be honest, every single person who's on this screen, the jury, I would rather see on Survivor than Bobby John.
Well, I think to your point, and as we talked about with Danny and Stephanie, I think there is the appeal of like, what would a 2nd time look for them versus Bobby John? Granted, it was so back-to-back, and I think the appeal would be, what does a 47-year-old Bobby John look like, especially if he's hungry to do this? But I would agree.
He goes by Robert John now.
Yeah, exactly. Robert Jonathan. Listen, I loved Bobby John. Bobby John Goes Apeshit is one of my favorite funny 115 entries. The fact that, as I talked about in Palau, there is this like genteel, buttoned up, rather polite Southern gentleman that just transforms into Mr. Hyde in challenges and is like beating his chest, grunting, punching himself in the face with a mouthful of balloon. And even in this season, he's still bringing that. He's like giving himself a hernia in that mud tug of war. Him and Janie obviously nearly have a fist fight. I would say if we somehow shift this narrative and it's like a rival season, I think you put Jamie and Bobby John on there above Rape and Judd. But I would feel like we passed that up in Survivor 40. I don't know if they would do that in Survivor 50. Again, I adore Bobby John. Back when I did ORGs, I played with a Bobby John avatar. I think the verdict is I'm okay with leaving him off the short list.
Yeah, there are people who fall into the Bobby John archetype of like kind of the, I guess alpha male challenge type guy. But I'd rather, even though he's played 3 times, I'd rather see someone like a Colby come back over Bobby John. And I don't think they're exactly the same player, but I think they are sort of similar and fit a similar archetype. But even for rivals, yes, but seeing Bobby John and Jamie play on the same season would be fun. But I almost think that I would rather see like Judd and Margaret go back on than Jamie and Bobby John, even though like I think Jamie is probably I'd rather see Jamie over Bobby John or Margaret, but I'd rather see Judd over any of them. So I think that's actually a rivalry that I would rather see, and you're not going to probably get if it's Survivor Rivals, which I'd be surprised if that's the season, even though I think it's a great idea. I don't think that I don't think we're getting 2 partnerships from Survivor Guatemala.
All right, well, let's clean up a bit with these other remaining jurors. We talked all about the men, and now it's time for the ladies. I want to talk about Cindy, because I think on paper, when you remember Cindy, you remember her because of like her talking with the monkeys and everything that happened with the car. But especially following sort of like her narrative after the show, I heavily recommend people check out her 2 Talking with T-Bird episodes. One she did by herself and one she did with her twin sister, Mindy, who is a Rock of Love alumni and an I Love Money winner. Her sister has had more appearances on reality TV than Cindy herself. Cindy, I think, could low-key be a very fun returnee. We'll talk about this at the end. I don't know if I would put her above the 4 that I have in mind from this season, but I feel like a Cindy return could be fun, and she is the 3rd person, as I was mentioning before, who got the availability called for Blood versus Water to play alongside, assumingly Mindy.
Yeah, I think Blood versus Water would be the best returning opportunity for her because of the fact that it's her twin sister. And also, I totally agree with you where their appearance on Talking with T-Bird was so much fun. And I kind of forgot that Cindy did the other one by herself. But yeah, having Cindy and Mindy and Jamie and Rami, all these rhyming twin names.
Judd and Tommy, luckgoing. Their parents had enough sense to give them completely different nicknames for their identical twins.
Yeah, Judd and Tud are going to come back. No, but Cindy would be, I think, a lot of fun with Mindy. But even without Mindy, she has the second most memorable car related moment in Survivor history. Of course, they would be eclipsed a couple seasons later in Fiji with the Yowman and Dreams fiasco. But I think that Cindy, even though I don't really remember so much of what she did in the pre-merge or in the early merge. You remember the car thing and you remember the Howler monkeys. I guess that's her main thing from the pre-merge, but she is a pretty good confessionalist. I think she was a decent player. I mean, she voted in the majority. I don't think she was the person who was necessarily driving things, but I think playing wise, she's probably an above average Survivor player just based on the fact that she was usually in the numbers. And I think that she would be a fun person to bring back. I think as a character, she was good on the show, and I think that learning more about her on Talking with T-Bird made me think that she could be kind of like the late great Clay Jordan, a diamond in the rough.
Yeah, I think there is a little bit of like candor with her that maybe didn't appear on the edit, but certainly did in her Talking with T-Bird, where I think she's 49 right now, and I think there's sort of like, as you get older, like you just don't give a shit about stuff anymore. She was saying some very open things about her Guatemala cast on Talking with T-Bird, and so I think she'd bring that sort of frankness, not Frank Garrett-ness, to the screen. Lastly, let's talk about Lydia. Sort of, even though Jamie is enigmatic, kind of an enigma in and of herself as well, because she probably has one of the most purple edits out of this entire cast besides the first 4 boots. She has, to the point that Jordan is dancing in the video version. She, of course, has the pancake and like the Nakum pump up song, but she ends up going to the end here and gets taken out in one of the more head-scratching endgame moves when Rafe and Stephanie decide to keep Danny over her. There's been some stuff that's come out after the fact about how Lydia was apparently actually a big favorite among the camp, that she was so well-liked, she was such a workhorse, which is why she and Jamie were so together towards the beginning of the game. She has this like big story, I think, about being a single mom as well, and obviously needing the money. And so they thought, okay, there's no chance we can take her towards the end of the game. Also, Danny, I think, was not doing well physically at the time, and so they thought they probably had a chance of beating Danny, which they unfortunately rue that choice at the end of the day. Lydia is just such a wild card that I think on paper she would kind of be a very fun WTF returnee to bring back. She's currently 61, which again is only a stone's throw away from some of like the 69-year-olds that we're bringing back from these early seasons. Unfortunately, again, it's just a matter of we have such a wealth of characters in this season, and there are only so many spots.
Yeah. I would love to see Lydia back on Survivor. I was a big fan of her on the show, and I think partly because of these random little moments that we did get, because she wasn't a huge character in Survivor Guatemala, but she has the pancake, as you said. She's the queen of rock and roll, apparently. And to get the queen of rock and roll back on Survivor 50, that is bringing in all of the music stands. So I think getting Lydia, it's not going to happen. But it would be, if you brought back Lydia, I think I will be rooting for Lydia to win Survivor season 50. And you know what? She came in fourth. She did well in the game. She got far. Like you just said, she apparently had winner potential. I don't think it's going to happen. I think it would be more aspirational, but I would love to see Lydia back on Survivor. And I would put her into like, maybe not my Rafe and Judd category, but I would put her in like the Gary Hogaboom. Not probably Gary a little higher than her, but I would put her in like the Jamie Cindy character of people I'd like to see back. You know what? No, I'd rather see Lydia than Jamie or Cindy. I'm saying.
Wow. All right. I love that we're slowly getting like Jordan's power rankings of which jury members he wants to see come back. I mean, again, this is what I'm looking at.
I think
seven.
Cindy, I think, has the best of those three: Cindy, Jamie, and Lydia. I think Cindy has the best chance to win out of the three of them. I think that Jamie is the most unique character out of the three of them. But seeing Lydia, the fishmonger Lydia, back on Survivor would tickle me the most.
Yeah, do you think that she'd be able to like catch fish in the Fijian Ocean without any fishing gear? She'd go full new era of like, we don't need that, Jeff. We're trading it back. I'm gonna go fishing for us.
Of course. Well, I don't know if do fishmongers actually do the fishing, or do they just sell the fish? I don't know if she's actually doing the fishing, but she has a lot of fish experience.
Yeah, if I recall, I do believe she built a net for Yasha to try to catch fish. I don't know how successful it was, but she did do some fishmonging.
Okay, so Lydia, yeah, I mean her tribe would be eating good in the neighborhood, and let's do it. Let's bring Lydia back.
All right, well, let's move into our pre-jury here, and we could sort of, I would say, maybe yada yada a bit through a majority of these, but there are some still heavy hitters to talk about towards the end here. So we have Jim Lynch, who unfortunately tore his bicep in the opening challenge and asked to be voted out. Mm-hmm. Morgan, the magician's assistant. Brianna, who didn't know what a pick was. We have Brooke, who sort of gets swap screwed when Judd flips. So I will say Brooke has popped up in some other places. I believe that she was doing some coverage on the Jack Vita show for like Deal or No Deal Island. Like she has some interest in reality TV. We have, of course, Jordan, your beloved, even though we might not need any fishing gear because we've got some bait here in the form of Blake, who is also someone that like is crumbling to pieces in the first episode. I believe he gets like a bunch of needles stuck in his skin, but is able to prevail from that. But of course, falls for the old trap of bragging about the size of your girlfriend's breasts and gets voted out summarily. The aforementioned Margaret, who ends up on the wrong side of the votes, but still goes out swinging in that memorable double tribal council when she decides to call out Judd, and Judd summarily calls her out apparently for, on the first day, you stood up and said Judd has ADD. Then we have, of course, Brian Corridon, the Platinum Man, who unfortunately was not able to shine his way through to the post-merge. Amy O'Hara, the Boston cop with a heart of gold, who prevailed through a rolled ankle and a bit of a bad swap to be the boot right before the merge. And finally, Brandon Bellinger, who, wound up on the wrong side of the numbers and didn't have that in with Stephanie and ends up becoming the merge boot here. So really, we've got a couple of people to talk about. Mm-hmm. I got to start with Brian, because I believe when I did the Guatemala podcast, I believe there was a category of like the Kelly Wentworth Award for pre-merger you would want to see back. Brian would be the one because, talk about potential. I mean, this is a guy who loved the show, who still loves the show. We know that he has been watching through the new era. I've seen him at a bunch of these watch parties. He's incredibly hungry and eager to go back. Even when he was on the wrong side of the numbers, when it was him, Gary, and Amy versus a bunch of Nakums, he's able to navigate this dynamic to flip Blake's former allies onto him and kind of gets screwed a bit by this double tribal council twist, and also the fact that like Rafe was the person who won individual immunity, and the story is that I think that Rafe kind of felt it was a neither can live while the other survives thing with the super duper fans, and so decided to kind of screw Brian over there. But Brian, I know, despite how stacked this Guatemala cast been, has been somebody that a lot of people have requested should get a second chance. And listen, I don't know how feasible it would be given how deep the well of super fans runs, especially nowadays, but I really want it, Jordan. I do
I
feel
do
like
too.
Brian, especially being this rare old schooler that does catch up with this modern seasons that is so fervently involved with the community.
Yeah, I think that Brian has paid his dues to the Survivor community. Like you said before, always at the watch parties. So he's been to so many RHAP events, and he's someone who, when you look at the game that he played, yes, he got swap screwed. He got put in a tough situation, but he wasn't the first person voted out. He did come up with the bait Blake strategy, which is obviously the most famous moment. But if you look at the pre-merge, he was the pre-swap. He wasn't in trouble in the pre-swap, but there was a point where he was working with Lydia, and he was able to get a vote off of Lydia. We wouldn't have had this. We wouldn't have even known what the pancake was if it weren't for Brian Corden, because Lydia would have gotten voted out early, and he was able to push the vote. I think I believe that was the Brianna vote, or maybe it was Morgan. I don't know. They're kind of interchangeable. I do think that Brian is a very good Survivor player based on what we saw from him, and anyone can get swap screwed. You also talked about Brooke Struck being someone who got swap screwed, where it seemed like she was in a pretty solid spot before the swap. But I think we saw way more from Brian than we did from Brooke. And I think he is someone who would be so much fun to see on the show. And I think the whole super fan thing is a double-edged sword, because we have so many people now in the super fan archetype, especially from the new era. So it might be harder for him to get on. But if he did get on, I feel like he's on with a lot of his people. And I think that he could do well. I think that he would really, bond well with some of these people who know what a one-off is, or who knows what an RHAP is. So I think that he would be a lot of fun playing with some of these new era players, and I hope it happens.
And I think also maybe something that he would have over someone like Brooke was also the fact that he delivered in personality as well. Yeah. Again, the reason why we call him Platinum is because of that iconic voting confessional he gave to Blake after he was able to succeed in digging his hole even deeper. So definitely someone that I would want to see come back. And another person I would suggest as well would be Amy, who was one of the Guatemala cast members that came the closest. The myth is that Amy was cast on Heroes versus Villains. They were sort of waiting to see what the status of Candace's work was before they would bring her on, and was she not able to fulfill her duties as a Survivor contestant? Apparently, Amy would be on as a hero, and I can absolutely see it. She was such a force. She was such a big personality. Of course, I always remember, the conversation she has with Gary, where she's like, if you screw me, I'm going down to Michigan and looking up Gary Hawkins, the landscaper, and I'm going to beat you down.
Yeah.
Or when she's talking about the Howler monkeys are like freaking Predator, like you could hear her accent upon looking at that picture. But then she also has this underdog storyline where, again, it's her, Gary, and Brian versus the Nakums. And during this big ball challenge, she rolls her ankle and keeps going through the challenge and keeps going through the game at a time when it wouldn't necessarily remove her from it. But considering the previous season, when Jeff Wilson rolls his ankle and is like, nah, I'm done. The fact that Amy was able to persevere, and were it not for, them losing the final immunity challenge before the merge, she would have made it to the merge. And I don't think she's necessarily the first boot. And then she sits on a jury. So to me, I love Amy as a character, and I do think the fact that, granted it was for season 20, but the fact that she was one of these rare Guatemala cast members kind of given another eye by producers does lend better than Brian, I would say, in terms of her chances of getting cast. She is, I believe, she is 58 at the moment, which is a bit on the older side. She admitted in her quarantine questionnaire that she kind of watches seasons on and off. Now, obviously not paying as much attention to it as someone like Brian, Judd, maybe even Bobby John. But still, I think she could study up on it if she was given the chance to play again.
Yeah, and if you talk about pairs that you'd love to see play together, I would love to see the payoff of her relationship with Gary Hawkins Hogaboom, because having them on the season, like I mean, I'm sure that look, they seemed like they were friends. They probably would want to work together. But imagine if like Amy gets in the voting booth, writes down Gary, I'm beating you down. Like that would be amazing. And I don't are we going to get Amy O'Hara back on Survivor? I hope so. I think it's probably unlikely because she does fall. Maybe not as many people in her archetype, but there's still like the Elaines and like the Janet Carvins, and it's kind of like this like blue collar like older woman, and I love that archetype. I think it's so much that they always seem to bring it when they're on the show. I think you put like Mama C in there, who's someone who almost won the game.
Yeah, just put a bunch of Boston people. Her, Trish, Amy.
Yeah,
throw them all on there.
I might hate their sports teams, but I love the old Boston women that are on Survivor. You could put I would have a whole tribe of old Boston women, and that would probably be my favorite tribe in Survivor history. So Amy's up there with me with Brian, and you know, more than anybody else who's on this pre-merge list. I always liked Brandon Bellinger. He was fun. You're also you get the Swifty bump because apparently he was Taylor Swift's bodyguard at one point.
Oh really? I didn't know this. That's wild.
Yeah, that story came out at some point during 46, where I believe he did serve as a bodyguard at some point. I don't remember the exact details.
Wow.
So you have that thing, but we can't just if you there's I think the number one Swiftie that I would want to see back on Survivor played on the most recent season. And then Blake Towsley, you're not putting Blake back on. It would be funny, but it's not happening.
Yeah, I'm sure he has matured considerably, where he would not necessarily gloat about his sexual exploits or any like memorable days on boats. I always loved Brandon. I think Brandon is someone who's really fun in doses. Like when he randomly quips about Judd having a premature evacuation, when during the big trek he jumps out of the boat early and is stuck in the mud.
He's the only guy who didn't get sick on that tribe.
Yeah, and then the scene between him and Bobby John where they're like having a debate about how close their alliance is while they're just peeing next to each other, and then they shake hands. Like Brandon was a low-key, very funny character on a scene full of very funny characters.
He was, but like I mean, you have to pick and choose. Guatemala is probably like it has in the past. It's probably not going to get as much attention as it deserves, and you really have to like pick from the top. And unfortunately, I don't think Brandon is necessarily at the top. He's just a fun guy who plays Survivor once. But yeah, from this list, the two that I would really be the most interested would be Amy and Brian. I think that would probably be the case for most of the fan base.
Yeah, so let's get into it, Jordan. Now, I imagine, I'm trying to be a mentalist here and read between the lines. I think we have our four, but just lock it in for me. Who would you like to formally nominate for the shortlist from Guatemala?
So the two that I think it would be irresponsible for us not to nominate Rafe, who I think was the best player on the season, and Judd, who I think was the best character on the season. Then you look at the rest of the list. I think that it really, to me, comes down, and I know I was high on her. Like I think that Lydia would be fun, but like the pancake isn't enough to put somebody on this list. I have to bring it down to four. Jamie Newton was such a big character. Gary's such a big character, but I think that the person whose story is not complete is Brian. So I think you have to put Brian Corden on this list. I think that if he did get on, could do very well with his people, or they could maybe see him as like, oh, we can't have this other super fan, this old school super fan around. Who knows? But I think it would be fun. So now to me, it comes down to a few people. It comes down to Amy O'Hara, Jamie Newton, and Gary Hogaboom. What do you think, Mike?
I'm gonna throw in Amy's hat into the ring, because I think she was, out of those three, given the most consideration for a returnee season. So I think it could be the best chance, despite the fact that, again, Jamie did get looked at for Blood versus Water, but I still think that it was more so for, you're going to be the original twinnies on Blood versus Water before Natalie and Nadia. I think that Amy, to that Brian class, I think has the most potential for a return. I think Jamie and Gary would be very fun personalities to just see like come back and play the game again and give more Survivor confessionals. Amy can do that, but also to your point with Brian, kind of have this undiscovered thing of like, listen, if she had just made it one step further, who knows what could have happened. So even though, I also think that if we're talking about those three, it seems like she has been the one that has like admitted, and maybe this is because she's the only one of the three that has filled out a quarantine questionnaire, but like, it seems like she's relatively watched some Survivor since, and that's not necessarily a exclusion from this type of list. And it's odd to put two pre-mergers on here, especially given such a stacked cast, but I don't know. The Guatemala lover in me kind of wants to put Amy
Yeah.
on here. I think, listen, these four are all going to be wishful thinking, especially. I really do not think whether they go with the legends, new era versus old era, etc., that any of these people are going to be given like a really comprehensive look at by production. This is more so to put people in the fan vote, and I want to put Amy in the fan vote.
I agree with you. I do think like I'm higher on Gary and Amy than I am on Jamie. I think Amy is the right choice, not just because she was pre-merge and we didn't get to see as much of her. But I think that I think I liked her confessionals more than I like Gary's, even though Gary was really funny. I think that Gary is a historic character in Survivor history because he found the first idol. And I think because of that, maybe you deserve some consideration, because if he finds an idol again, that'll be a cool moment. But
what if it's a fake idol? What if it's a Beware advantage?
That would be that would be great too. I think if Gary's on, the clue has to be it's definitely not on the ground, man. And then he's like, wait a second, I've heard this before. And then he looks up in the trees and finds another idol. But if we could do 5, I would put Gary in. But I think since we're limiting it to 4, I think it has to be Amy and Brian.
I mean, listen, Rob already kind of pushed it early on before, though I am very grateful now in retrospect, considering that now I believe we brought back 4 people from Africa, Marquesas, Vanuatu, and now Guatemala. And spoiler alert, we're not stopping there anytime soon. But yeah, 5 might be a bit too much. Maybe I'll be convinced the other way after the fact by the commenters or anything. But I feel good about this quartet, personally, to at least enter into a fan poll. Again, a lot of exercises with these seasons is, well, they're probably not going to be brought back, but this is the emphasis on should rather than could.
This isn't the actual vote, but look, maybe as Rob was saying on the Borneo podcast, maybe people at CVS look at this and they're like, oh, everyone wants to see Amy O'Hara. Let's bring back Amy O'Hara. Let's bring back Brian Corden. And then also, I feel like, to me, how is Judd a one-time Survivor player? I don't get it. And maybe it has to do with some stuff with, behind the scenes that we didn't see, but this guy is one of the biggest characters in Survivor history. I really think he is. And I think he's a bigger character than other people who have come back 2 and 3 times that we look at as Survivor legends. So I think we need to see it. And then Rafe, in terms of gameplay, like you look at a lot of recent players who have come so close, like a Charlie, like an Omer, like a Jesse, and I feel like Rafe is like the old version of that category of people who played so well and came up a little bit short.
Yeah, I mean, very much in the Rob Cesternino mold, right? Of like the super fan who kind of defies the odds given their archetype, makes it to the end, is the odds-on favorite to win, and loses right before the final. Last thing I want to ask Jordan is, if we could pick anyone from this cast to be in another reality show besides Survivor, what would it be? Should Cindy take a turn on Rock and Bluff?
I think, should we take someone that we didn't? I mean,
sure.
Imagine Judd on Traders. I'll say that. I mean,
Judd on Traders would be incredible because, again, you've run so many games of Mafia, Jordan. You know how angry people can get screaming at each other about lying. That is Judd's game in a nutshell.
Yeah, but let's put Blake Towsley on like House Hunters, because he is a real estate agent. Now, I think that the move. What if we had the Cindy and Mindy twin twist on Big Brother? I don't know. That could be a good one.
That would be very fun. They sort of gave me a bit of like Adria and Natalie vibes of like they are fiery personalities, and it seemed like they're pretty indistinguishable from my perspective. So I think they could possibly switch off.
No, or you put Lydia on Diners, Drive-ins, and Diners, Drive-ins, and Dives, and have her make pancakes.
No, I put her on like The Greatest Catch.
Okay.
That's good too. Imagine her like on a fishing boat trying to keep everyone's moods at bay.
Yeah, I like it. I love you, Bay. Yeah.
All right. Well, Jordan, this was an incredible time. This is probably one of the longest podcasts we've done in this series. And I think it's due in part of the fact that this is a season you and I both love. And it's also a really surprisingly stacked cast.
It is. It really is. This there's so many good players, and it's kind of insane that no one's with the exception now of Danny Boatwright, who got to play Winners at War. No OG player has come back yet. Stephanie is clearly the biggest name on this cast, but there are people like I would be as much as I love Stephanie LaGrossa and has as historic of a player she is and legendary of a player, I think the 4 people we put on this list, I think I'd rather see them back than Stephanie, and I love Stephanie LaGrossa.
All right, Jordan, lastly, anything you want to plug in terms of social media, podcasts, etc., for the listeners to check out?
I mean, look, we had a lot of fun with Twitch this past season. I don't know what next season is going to look like. I mean, I love the format, but it's not easy. We've sort of exhausted a lot of the list of the people who would play Twitch. So I don't know what that's going to look like next season.
Oh, do we need a wish list podcast for people on the Twitch
I think
list?
we need a Twitch list podcast. I think we need to have four players per season that we put on that could play Twitch in the future. There's got to be some old school super fan trivia masters that we don't even know about yet. Ryan Gordon. I feel like he's been on Twitch before, but I would have him back. But yeah, that's I'm this summer I'm going to be away for most of the summer, so I'm not going to be doing all that much podcasting. But I'll be back in some form coming up in the next season. And just keep listening to these. Keep listening to this specific podcast series that you're listening to. They're a lot of fun.
Thank you, Jordan, for the plug of this podcast series. Yeah. Well, don't worry. There'll be another one in your feed tomorrow, as really the character hits will keep on coming, as we are going to Survivor Panama, Exile Island. It was the birth of a legend in Suri, but along with a lot of colorful characters around here in the form of the Kasaya tribe. I'll be getting together with Mari Forth to talk about the cast of Exile Island and who will be pushing through from there. Of course, make sure you don't miss a second of it. RobHasAWebsite.com/Survivor feed for the podcast version, and RobHasAWebsite.com/YouTube for the video version. Thank you all so much for listening, especially to this extra long podcast comparatively. Sorry, Sam, but I think it was worth it. Jordan, thank you so much. We'll be back tomorrow with Panama alongside Mari Forth. Until then, everybody, take care. Bye-bye.